You're listening to Natural Resources University. In this podcast network, our hosts are university researchers and extension specialists, opening your gateway to the science of natural resource management.
Welcome to Habitat University. This podcast is your source for the science behind wildlife habitat management and is part of the Natural Resources University podcast network. We're your hosts, Jared Brook.
And I'm Adam Janke, and we're both biologists and extension wildlife specialists. If you're interested in wildlife habitat management or looking for ways to improve your property for wildlife, this is the podcast for you.
So join us as we talk with researchers, managers, and landowners all about the latest research and the ins and outs of wildlife habitat management. All right, so Adam, I was out the other day with a group of landowners, and it was myself, another biologist here in Indiana, and the group of landowners, and we're kind of walking through the woods for a field day and workshop, and talking about habitat management and stuff. And this biologist friend of mine, he's really into birds and a birder, and so he was sitting there talking about all the birds that we were hearing as we were walking through the woods. And I'm sitting there and I'm not a birder. I know a few calls, but not all of them. So he was, telling me birds that I didn't know. But as we were walking, he was looking up and I was looking down. And all I was doing is looking at plants and IDing plants as we walked. So he taught me a few things about birds, but I also taught him a few things about plants. And so I thought it was a great way to start the episode that we're going to talk all about plants and wildlife. Probably talk more about plants and wildlife and why that's important.
Yeah, I think that's something we've been doing throughout the podcast already, and I assume the listeners have already caught on to. We call ourselves wildlife biologists, or really that just means we concern ourselves with plants and their relationships to disturbances or abiotic characteristics of where they grow and other things. And I find also that I sort of like chronically disappoint people when I tell them I'm a wildlife biologist and they ask me some random fact that they learned about a zoo animal or whatever. And I just sort of look at them back with a blank face because like you say, really what wildlife ecologists end up doing is just learning a lot about plants and the places animals live. And we don't really learn that much about the animals themselves other than their relationships to plants. So yes, I'm with you. I like your thinking. I've definitely been in your shoes before. Your ornithologist story makes me kind of think of how central plants are to wildlife and wildlife ecology, given that we see so many animals named for the places they live and the plants they depend on. So we were talking about this as we were getting ready for this episode. All the species that we could name that are named just for plants. So sage grouse, wood duck, spruce grouse, alder flycatcher, willow flycatcher, cedar waxwing, cedron, pine grosbeak, pine siskin, orchard oriole, all sorts of birds. Of course, the listeners will know our bias towards birds are named for plants and their relationships. There's even scientific names where birds or animals are named after the plants on which they depend. The bobolink was one. Do you know the scientific name of the bobolink, Jared?
Couldn't tell you.
I couldn't. I'm going to butcher the pronunciation here. But I'm not even going to try the genus. But the species name is Oryzivorus. I have no idea if I pronounced that right, but we'll break it down. The Latin name Oryza is Latin for rice. In vorus, the listeners will recognize for carnivorous or insectivorous or other things that's just devouring or eating of. So the bobolink, is named after a plant. Its scientific name is named after a plant. So yes, connections between wildlife and plants are ubiquitous and central to wildlife habitat management. So I'm super excited about this episode.
And I got another name of wildlife species that I'll throw to our guests here in a second, but we thought, what better way to talk about plants than not even have a botanist on, but have three wildlife extension specialists talk about plants and wildlife. So we decided to have on a guest who is a friend, mentor, and now colleague of mine, and colleague of Adam's as well, kind of the person that taught me all about the relationship of plants and wildlife, and how to identify all these different plants and the importance of that. So we're glad to welcome on Dr. Craig Harper from the University of Tennessee. So Craig, thanks for joining us.
It is absolutely my pleasure.
And the species that I wanted to throw to you was, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, but it's an acorn woodpecker.
Well, you've mispronounced it, but yes, it is an acorn woodpecker. I
just listened to I just listened to a podcast all about acorn versus acorn. So
we don't
bring
have
that up.
in Tennessee, but I have seen them out west. They have acorns out west.
Yeah, I figured that was a good one.
They might not know it, but they do have acorns out west.
If you asked them, they wouldn't, right? But I thought that was a good one to get us started with. But if you've listened to anything from Natural Resource University or Fire University or lots of other Deer University, lots of other podcasts, you've heard a lot from Craig. So we thought it would be a great opportunity to invite him on to talk all about plants and wildlife.
One of my favorite subjects.
All right, good. We got the right person then. So kind of our first question is really why is having a basic understanding about plants important from a habitat management standpoint?
Well, gosh, that's pretty easy. What is habitat?
Are you looking at us to answer?
I'm intimidated all this time.
Yeah, you're turning the tables on us.
Maybe I didn't teach as well as I thought. I tell you, it's just as simple as the collection of resources that a particular species needs. And so, what are those resources? And as we learned in Wildlife 101. Food, cover, and water. And so for a majority of the wildlife species that we work with, what represents the food and the cover or shelter? And for probably certainly a majority of them, we're talking about vegetation. And so I've often argued, how could you be a wildlife biologist and not know something about plants? And you don't have to be a botanist, but to have some working knowledge of what are the dominant plant species on the landscape that you're working in, which ones are used as food or as cover by the different wildlife species that you are managing, researching, working with, or even hunting. I give so many workshops, seminars, etc., to hunters and deer hunters more than any others. And of course, they always know what they're planting in their food plot. And well, at least the majority of them do. And so I ask, if you didn't have a food plot, what would the deer eat? And a lot of them will look at you like, the deer in the headlights. But hello, the answer is vegetation. And so why wouldn't you want to know which plants the deer eat and which plants they don't eat? And the same could be said for quail or turkeys or whatever other game species, but also for non-game species. Which are those plants most important for nesting? Which are those plants most important for various pollinators? On and on and on. So for a wildlife biologist to not have some working knowledge of plants, I think is a real a limiting factor.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and I think that that's probably one of the most undervalued skills from a land manager or wildlife manager's toolbox, is having that knowledge of plants and plant communities and their relationships to wildlife. And at a minimum, if you're a hunter, then you can, and you learn some plants, it can make you a better hunter, but you can really impress your buddies in hunting camp with your knowledge of plant identification as you go out in the woods. And I know I've certainly done that through my learnings with plant ID. But again, you don't have to be a botanist, at least have a general understanding.
Well, I don't hold some of the guys and gals who are biologists and managers necessarily personally responsible for some of their general lack of knowledge on plants. A lot of that goes right back to the universities where they got their degrees and the programs in which they got their degrees. Oftentimes, you might have a course in botany, but not necessarily a course in field plants, not necessarily a course that is relating the different vegetation species to, for example, some of the focal wildlife species that you might be working with. And so across the board, at least with the universities and their wildlife programs that I am familiar with, and I'm familiar with the curriculum that is offered in a whole bunch of them, most of them do not do an adequate job with regard to teaching the students, the undergraduates, the importance of and helping them learn the different plants. And that's not just herbaceous plants, but the shrubs and trees as well.
And that's why we brought you on for a university level course on field botany.
In 40 minutes. Shouldn't
That's
be a
right.
problem.
I wanted to get to one quote that kind of sets up the thinking that Adam and I had on why we wanted to do this episode and why we wanted to have you on. And this is from a book from the 1950s called American Wildlife and Plants, A Guide to Wildlife Food Habits. And the quote is that all animals owe their existence to trees, grasses, weeds, farm crops, aquatics, and other forms of vegetation. Animal-eating species are no exception to the rule. Their dependence is at most a step or two removed. Plants are the intermediate and ultimate sources of all food and most of shelter used by wildlife. Yeah, and that's a book that I would recommend to anyone who's interested in habitat management. And it was written in the 50s, but it includes information from hundreds of food studies of different wildlife species that really kind of ranks out, here are the different species of plants that wildlife eat, and to what degree they eat them and how frequent are they found in diets of different animals. And it's a wealth of information.
So Craig, you're the greatest champion for plants and wildlife literacy, like understanding plants and basic botany and plant succession principles. We're curious, what are your key words? What do you think landowners or wildlife biologists need to absolutely understand, starting perhaps with, what is the definition of a plant in your world? And then take us through some of your keywords from there.
Oh gosh, there's a lot. I won't belabor this. I kind of figured you might ask about it, but obviously the first one, the huge one is habitat. There is no other word in wildlife management, in my opinion, that is misused more than the word habitat. From habitat type, or that pine stand is a great habitat for a pine warbler, or this field is a habitat. It's just on and on and on. We have nesting habitat and brooding habitat and roosting habitat. How many habitats does a bobwhite quail need, or a northern bobwhite, if you want to use that phrase? So what people generally are referring to are vegetation types. A vegetation type is not, quote, a habitat. If we go back to some of the classic wildlife literature and the textbooks that most of us learn from, we find that habitat is, in general, what we consider a wildlife term to describe the resources, food, cover, water, shelter, for a given wildlife species in a spatial arrangement. So the spatial component also is incorporated into the definition of habitat. And so you can't just use the word habitat synonymously with vegetation. It's incorrect. You will find a loggerhead shrike and a northern bobwhite in the same exact area, but their habitat is not the same. They eat different foods, they nest in different places, they have lots of different requirements. And so that word is highly misunderstood and misused, in my opinion. And there's a whole lot of wildlife professionals who, over the past 2 or 3 decades, have continued to try and promote more accurate use of terms and published paper after paper, but changing this use of terminology is very difficult.
Craig, I think you'll be happy to know that our first episode was all about that problem.
Oh, well,
And
good.
we actually found a term for it, and it's habitat is a pancrestin problem, meaning
boy.
that it's used so widely that it's become ambiguous.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is exactly right. And how many times have I talked to different people, and you listen to, wildlife professionals give presentations, whether it's in the Wildlife Society in the meetings or a professor in a classroom, and they use habitat almost as a crutch word for everything that they're talking about. They'll use the word habitat 3 times in one sentence, meaning 3 different things. And so, it turns into just being meaningless.
Well, that's what the podcast is for. We're trying to break that down and dig in deep on the meaning of habitat, and we have, to the extent possible, tried to use center an accurate definition, and we share your definition in the podcast. And in fact, I remember debates on the podcast that referenced your perspectives about habitat types versus vegetation types and successional communities too. So we definitely appreciate that and have had that reflected in past episodes.
Well, I'm not trying to base things, obviously on my opinion. I'm trying to base things to be accurate so people can have a clear understanding of what we're talking about. And another perfect example that's, easily on the top of my head is grassland. There's lots of ecologists who consider any plant community with somewhat of a grassy or even, let's say, herbaceous understory or plant cover as a grassland. And I don't have a personal problem with those folks, but I think that is terribly, terribly misleading. And I was with a renowned botanist not long ago on a field tour with a group of biologists and managers with state wildlife agency and a federal agency. And we were talking about grassland restoration and early succession and restoration of woodlands. And we were on a site where, all of these vegetation types were present. And we were talking about all kinds of things. And everything was referred to by this person as a grassland. And I said, hold on, everybody. I said, let's just stop, in mid-stride. Let's just stop here and think about this. I said, I'm not trying to argue in the face of anybody, but I could see on y'all's faces that you're confused. And I said, if this is a grassland and we're standing in an oak woodland, then by definition, that makes a red-headed woodpecker a grassland obligate. That's the problem. We are being confusing to others, and not just landowners who are completely confused when we call a northern bobwhite an early successional bird and a rough grouse an early successional bird, or that they both require early succession. That is patently false. A rough grouse does not require early succession. Of tens of thousands of telemetry locations that we collected on rough grouse in the southern Appalachians, less than 10 were in early successional communities, which would be those communities dominated by shade intolerant herbaceous plants, not trees. An understory of a forest, albeit grassy and or herbaceous with forbs and ferns and whatnot, is not early succession. Those plants largely are intermediate in their shade tolerance, or they are actually shade tolerant. And so those are not by definition what we would refer to as early successional plants. And so how we relate these plant communities to the needs of various wildlife species can be confusing, not only to landowners, but then as we continue to espouse this in workshops and everything else, we're confusing many managers or biologists with state wildlife agencies. And then that perpetuates the misuse of these terms.
Okay, Craig, we're going to take you a step back because a lot of the words that you used, I think, may not be familiar to all the listeners. And so I was trying to capture some of them, and I trust Jared was doing the same thing as we go. And so we're going to do a rapid fire round of definitions. And I don't know what the rules are. I can tell you're kind of giving me a funny look already, but we're going to succinct definitions of the following terms to help the listeners catch up with different key terms as we think about how wildlife relate to plants.
They're right.
So you just said ecological succession, and I think you've done a nice job of defining that. We actually have later on, we want to talk more about it, and I really liked how you were distinguishing woody vegetation, herbaceous vegetation. So the first word I want to ask for a definition of is, what's your definition of herbaceous vegetation, and what are different characteristics of herbaceous vegetation we find on farms and ranches across the U.S.?
The herbaceous vegetation that is ubiquitous across the eastern and midwestern U.S. is grasses, forbs, sedges, rushes, ferns, any non-woody plant essentially is colloquially termed herbaceous vegetation. Now, among researchers, that often can be a confusing point when graduate students, for example, go out and collect vegetation data, and they include brambles, such as the blackberries, raspberries, and dewberries as a forb or as herbaceous vegetation. I think it's more accurate to characterize brambles as brambles. I don't even necessarily put them in as briars. Smilax, for example, is colloquially called a briar, but that is a vining plant. And so we always classify these as what they are. Now we'll group forbs and ferns and grasses and sedges. And we actually, when we're collecting data, identify everything to species. So if you do that, then you can group them in any way you want, as long as you define that, carefully, then the reader or the listener will understand what you're talking about. And then we don't just call things woody. We will, we'll have it identified to species, but we'll identify those as shrubs or trees. And so that then allows the researcher, for example, to group in anything from forbs or grasses together, or you might say quail food plants or deer forage plants, or you can mix things in various groups as is appropriate for what you're analyzing. But herbaceous species are those non-woody species, and I would not include brambles even in that. We oftentimes term those as, I've seen the term semi-woody species, which, you can use that if you want, but it's not wood.
Okay. Yeah, we have that in prairie ecosystems too, with like lead plant. It's kind of this ambiguous plant between herbaceous and woody vegetation. It's kind of like a shrub, but it's really not. But particularly in arid regions, it's as close as you get to a shrub. So follow you there.
So you said one in there that is probably the one that I get the most confused looks on faces when I give a presentation about vegetation or about habitat management, and that's forb, right? So I think some people know what forb is. Not a lot of people know what forb is, and they often get it mixed up a little bit with a legume. So can you kind of tease out forb and legume and what those are?
Well, a forb is a forbaceous plant, and that's a dicot. Not a monocot. So there's a difference in the leaf structure, of course. The majority of legumes are forbs, but there are some legumes such as black locust, honey locust, that are trees. So it's not necessarily accurate to throw all legumes into herbaceous plants, because on many of our vegetation samples will have, black locust or honey locust or other species in there.
And I think I've heard landowners kind of, and obviously they're not, and you just made that point, but I've heard landowners talk about them synonymously. Like they'll be talking about forbs, but they'll be saying, legumes, but there's obviously a distinction.
And so, a dicot produces what we call a dicotyledon, and they'll have, two little small leaves that are coming out of the seed as soon as it germinates, whereas a monocotyledon, will only have one little sprout coming out of the seed, which is obviously similar to what you would find with a grass.
So run through a few examples. You just said it, but run through a few examples of plant species that are monocots versus plant species that are forbs.
Well, for the grasses, many of the common non-native grasses would be tall fescue, orchard grass, timothy, Bermuda grass, Johnson grass, Bahia grass. I mean, there's many, and common forbs that we have, in early successional communities, for example, the classic partridge pea, ragweed, pokeweed. Crops that might be planted include clovers and soybeans, cowpeas, sunflowers, of course, corn and sorghum are grasses. I don't know what all else you're hoping.
No, that's just kind of get some examples so kind of people can picture, all right, here's the distinction of what's a forb versus what's a grass and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, we're just kind of trying to check on vocab too, and you offered a definition of dicot, you offered a definition of monocot. I think, did you say legumes are nitrogen fixers, and that can be both trees or herbaceous plants? One thing that you did just say that we wanted to check on vocab is you just said non-native versus native. So could you offer a succinct definition of what you mean when you say native and non-native, and how that factors into wildlife and plants?
Well, that can be very loose also. So that's up to the specific situation, really. To a lot of issues, native to a particular area is very important. Then more general, perhaps native to North America is important. We have so many non-native species from Asia, South America, Europe, are out competing our native plants and have severely deteriorated habitat, that's the correct use, for many wildlife species. But then it also could be argued that big blue stem that originated in Kansas and planted in East Tennessee also is non-native. So it's according to how you want to split hairs. We've done work in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, for example, relatively recently, with regard to restoring early successional communities in Cades Cove, which was, pretty much dominated all of the open fields by tall fescue, which was planted in the mid 1900s for livestock grazing and for hay. And so if we wanted to compare the response of the seed bank after we eradicate the non-native grass cover with the response of planted species, and we had a mixture of native grasses and forbs that we were going to use, of course, the park personnel would not allow us to use those mixtures of species or varieties that were not explicitly native to Cades Cove. And so the species that we had to use in the planted treatments in Cades Cove were seeds of plants collected at Cades Cove. So how you want to define native versus non-native can have, varying scales.
Yeah, and I think where the rubber meets the road on the native versus non-native and different types of plants is really where our next question comes. And so our next question was really broad, but how do plants form the basis of wildlife habitat? If we use the wildlife habitat definition that we're using in the podcast, and also the one that you offered independently, we should add, at the beginning of the episode here, that wildlife habitat is food, water, and cover that wildlife need. What we wanted to do next was kind of start to ask you questions about, like, okay, how do plants become food, water, and cover for wildlife, and what does that look like for different species of plants or different plant communities? And so what we thought we would start with is the first and the biggest category, and I think the one that people most intuitively associate with plants, and that is food. So how do plants become food for wildlife? And I want you to kind of like share with us your thought process on how you describe that, how it is that animals derive nutrients and other things that they need to survive from plants, and what factors influence the quality of a plant, such as whether or not it's native or not.
Well, obviously, a plant can provide food either by the foliage, the plant itself being eaten by a particular wildlife species, or by the seed or fruit that is produced, and then providing whether it's seed, soft mast, hard mast, what have you. Of course, the flowers provide nectar for a wide array of pollinators, whether that's butterflies, bees, various birds, all kinds of different species. And I would argue that various plants are important for food based on other animals that are attracted to those plants. So, for example, if you're interested in, and I keep going back to quail, of course, Jared.
We talk a lot about quail on this podcast.
His master's degree.
You're in good company.
Quail, of course, require insects. And so insect populations are going to be much greater in vegetation communities that are dominated by forbs. And I'm speaking of, an old field, some early successional community that is dominated by forbs, as opposed to one that is dominated by grasses. And at least to my understanding and what I have read, and I have not explicitly researched this, but because of the increased relative lignin content and relative indigestibility of grasses, as opposed to that relative digestibility and structural components that many forbs provide versus the grasses, the forbs support a much greater insect population than do grasses on average. And so, I think that also could be considered.
Yeah, I think that's what the beauty of that quote that Jared started the episode with from that Martin book, where it said animal eating species are no exception to the rule. Their dependence is at most a step or two removed. We definitely think of that. And I know there was some research out of the East Coast recently that looked at like Carolina chickadee life history in different backyards in urban areas in the East. And they found that backyards that had higher proportions of native plants had higher Carolina chickadee productivity, because one step removed from native plants and Carolina chickadees is the caterpillars that those native plants host. So if you increase native plant abundance in a backyard, you increase caterpillars. And if you increase caterpillars, then you increase chickadee production. So kind of a really neat way that plants and animals are connected by different degrees of separation than we often think of. Another question that you just brought up is digestibility, and you were talking about it relative to insects and digestibility of plants, but what about wildlife? Insects or wildlife, but vertebrate wildlife that we tend to think the most about in digestibility, like, for example, like white-tailed deer or other things. What's a wildlife biologist or land manager need to understand about variable digestibility of different food types that plants provide?
Well, again, you're bringing up great big topics, but in a nutshell, digestibility of a plant decreases over time as the plant matures and the cell walls grow, thicken, become more mature, harden, and so the lignin content of the plant increases, and that is a structural carbohydrate that is relatively indigestible. And so as the digestibility of the plant decreases, so does the digestible nutrients that are associated with the plant. And so for species such as white-tailed deer or even groundhogs or cottontails, for example, you oftentimes, and this is very, very common with white-tailed deer, you will see them eating the most tender, young, and digestible portion of the plant, because that's the portion of the plant that is most palatable, digestible, and they get the most nutrition from. And so a difference there between grasses and forbs is how they grow. And so as a grass grows upward, the oldest part of the stem is at the tip, the oldest part of the plant. Well, as a forb grows, there are new leaves coming out at the ends of the stem over time until the plant flowers, if it's determinate, and even after the plant flowers, if it's indeterminate. You know, a determinate plant, you know, it flowers, produces seed, and it's done, whereas an indeterminate will flower and continue to grow. And so, you know, there's this thought that is very common among people, and this is very true amongst people who are trying to manage land for deer, that, oh, I need to mow my field to make it more, the plants more digestible and attractive to deer. Well, that comes largely from the agronomic literature, where tons of work have been done looking at the nutritional quality, digestibility of pastures and hayland, of course. And that's very, very true in that situation, and especially with regard to how they collect the data. And so if you go out there with some frame and throw it down and you cut off the vegetation, you know, an inch or whatever from the ground, and you collect all of that material, you dry it, grind it up, send it to the lab, and they analyze it for nutritional content. The longer you wait after it being clipped, the lower the digestibility and digestible nutrients, because the plant is older. But that is not the case with forbs. And that would be true of leguminous forbs, such as clovers and alfalfa, which also is also sampled in pasture settings. And so if you go into an alfalfa or you know, like a red clover patch that has a relatively large stem as opposed to ladino, and you clip that off when it's about, let's say, you know, 18 inches high, you know, 12 to 18 inches high, and you send that whole plant sample to the lab, yes, the longer you wait, the lower the digestibility and lower nutritional content. However, deer, for example, is what we classify as a concentrate selector, meaning it concentrates its foraging on select plants and select plant parts. And so if you only collect those portions of the plants that deer are eating, they're not eating those great big lignous stems down there closer to the ground, for example, with alfalfa or red clover, they're eating the leaves. And so if you look at yield produced over the course of a summer and the nutritional quality of those plants, you will find that in unmowed plots, there is greater biomass. And if you're only collecting those portions of the plants that deer eat, there's greater biomass than in mowed plots. And those portions of the plants that deer eat are not different with regard to nutritional quality than those that have been mowed, because those leaves continue to be produced. And the same thing is true in early successional communities when you consider plants such as, you know, blackberry or ragweed or pokeweed or many of these plants that deer eat, continue to grow and produce fresh leaves at the tips of the twigs. And so I tell people to stop mowing their fields during midsummer if they're trying to manage for deer, because number one, you're not making them more nutritious or more attractive. And number two, you're totally destroying the cover which the deer are associated with in that old field or early successional community. So it's really a lose-lose situation when you're doing that.
That's a really interesting story about deer that I didn't really understand, about how selective they are about where they feed on the plant to maximize the amount of nutrients that they're capturing. And so one of the things we wanted to talk about that brings up is, like, what do plants provide? And nutrients were a big one of them. And I know we, in the migratory bird world that I'm more familiar with, we definitely see this where animals are really selective for certain types of nutrients during certain times of the year, particularly for migratory birds, energy-rich foods that have a lot of fat that they can turn into essentially the fuel that carries them on their long migratory journey. So kind of an interesting parallel about how these animals just know how to seek out nutrients, and maybe what we know from from livestock studies don't necessarily translate particularly well. Another thing we were going to ask you about is what other types of things do animals get from the food that they eat? And one idea we have, and I don't know how much you'll know about carotenoids, but a lot of animals literally are what they eat. They rely on intake of certain nutrients to, for example, fuel migration or grow antlers or to color their feathers, as we see with carotenoids. So what are we missing? What other sorts of things do animals get from the dietary intake of plants?
With regard to nutrients, of course, there's an array of nutrients, and we certainly have seen that selection of various plants for certain nutrients, as you just discussed. I know Marcus Lashley, in his PhD thesis, identified various plants that were higher in phosphorus concentrations, and that was a limiting factor in their diet at where he worked at Fort Bragg, and they were selecting those plants over others. And certainly there may be various micronutrients that are involved, whether it's copper or boron. There's many different nutrients, macronutrients and micronutrients, that might be needed. But let me also clarify, I am not a physiologist, and so I haven't delved into the various compounds that certain plants may have with regard to some biological needs of different species. And so and so maybe to directly answer your question, I do not know how birds might select certain plants to help them gain a certain hue of feather. Although I have read that that is true, that is not something I've done.
Yeah, I think I looked some of this stuff up, and to kind of bring it back to a point we talked about earlier versus native versus non-native plants. Like, there's a body of literature, and I don't know that birds are selecting for these species to color their feathers or for that reason, but it's certainly leading to it. So there's some studies that have looked at the birds' use of, and one I'm talking about is northern flickers. So northern flickers' use of bush honeysuckle. So in areas where you have higher concentrations of the non-native bush honeysuckle, so Amur honeysuckle, you actually get a pinkish hue to the shafts of northern flickers' feathers, right? They typically in the east they'd be yellow, but now they're kind of pinkish in areas where there's a heavy concentration of bush honeysuckle, just from eating all of those berries that are that red color.
So another thing that animals get from their diet in some cases that we don't always think about, but it's our next component of wildlife habitat, is water. So what about animals that use plants as a way to satisfy or check that water box when we talk about wildlife habitat?
Well, certainly there are many wildlife species that do not necessarily require freestanding water, but get their water requirement either from the plants, and that might be especially true, of course, in summertime, when anywhere from 75 to 90% of the weight of a given plant, and especially in the leaf, is water. And so, those water requirements may vary by season, and not just by species, but within a species by season, whereas there are other species that definitely require a lot of freestanding water on a daily basis. And the one thing that I'll mention, among wildlife managers, there are two things related to habitat that probably do not get as much attention than the others. One is water. How close are the water resources on a given property, and what are the water needs of a given focal species? And so all of the concentration really is towards food or cover, but a lot of times water is overlooked. And then the other thing is the arrangement of habitat. And so how is the cover versus the food versus the water arranged in a given area for a certain wildlife species that you're managing for, because you certainly can influence the usability of an area and the number of species that a certain area can support by adjusting the arrangement of the amount of and the frequency of food resources versus cover resources versus water resources.
Yeah, so that arrangement of those different plant communities that may provide food or cover or provide both food and cover hits that partially hits that space aspect of habitat.
And
so
not only the species, but the structure. You know, you can have an oak hickory forest that is 5 years old and it has a totally different structure and provides different things for different wildlife species than an oak hickory forest that's 95 years old.
Yeah, so that's where we want to take this next. Is we wanted to get at that with the cover aspect, right? So how do plants and their structure provide cover for various wildlife species?
Cover is really influenced by what we often term the structure of the plants, which is really refers to the density and the height of plants. And so what that really is getting to is the visibility that is within a vegetation type. And so, you know, a species like a brown thrasher likes much more dense cover than an eastern bluebird, for example. A catbird is going to be found in more dense cover, like a white-eyed vireo, than, you know, obviously a meadowlark that is out in a grassland, or even a robin or a mockingbird that might be in more of, you know, in terms of a natural setting, and more in a woodland, similar to a scarlet tanager, or, you know, a red-headed woodpecker. So the structural requirement, I think, is probably more influential on more species in terms of the areas that they use and where they are found than actually the composition of the plants.
That's a really good point. And I think, you know, there's certainly those species that are tied to, you know, single species of plants by themselves or things. But for a lot of times, you know, you may be able to change out the actual species that's providing the structure, and you're still going to have that wildlife species. And that's where that structure is more important than that composition piece.
And that really brings up a problem with some people. You know, you just mentioned the shrub honeysuckle and Chinese privet, you know, obviously non-native to Eastern North America, but there's a lot of birds that are perfectly happy in a privet or bush honeysuckle thicket. And then, you know, you think of, okay, how do these things spread? Well, they spread, a lot of them, by birds, because birds are using them exclusively. So, you know, that's something that we wildlife managers have to wrestle with is, okay, we want to manage for, you know, bird species X, Y, and Z, and they really enjoy the cover and the food resources of some of these plants. But wait a minute, these plants aren't even native to North America. So what should we do?
I think that's a perennial challenge in wildlife habitat, and particularly wildlife habitat education, is that there's shades of gray. Yes, lots of birds take advantage of the resources provided by honeysuckle, but we have to couch that in the context of all the harm that honeysuckle does, or you know, creating a concept that we talked about in our last episode, the concept of ecological sinks and things like that. So a real challenge. So, okay, we've done food value of plants. We've done the water value of plants. We've now broken down the cover value of plants. And so I think what we can do now, if we're not missing anything, Jared, I'm looking at you to make sure we got all of our food, water, and cover. What we want to do now is that we could move on and kind of ask you, what do we need to know about plants? So now it's time for Botany 101 or whatever sort of Ecology 101. How do these plants go together in the environment? What's a wildlife ecologist need to be thinking about? And maybe I could just launch the discussion off with what you talked about earlier in the episode about successional communities. And we think maybe thinking about where these different species of plants fall in different successional communities might be a good way for us to start with our Botany 101 or Ecology 101 lesson.
Yes, and but I wouldn't. I don't think of it as Botany 101 or really Ecology 101, and although it's really related to ecology, I think about it more as Management 101. So if I'm managing a area, a property, whether it be a private property or a wildlife management area for any species, I number one think about obviously the habitat requirements of that species. And so there are many generalist species that may use lots of different vegetation types and of different ages, successional stages. And then there are some that are, of course, more specialized, that they require forest, or they require a grassland, they require early succession or shrub cover, whatever the case may be. And so I'm trying to match the structural requirements in an arrangement on that property that will help that property hold as many of that species as possible. Now, that is what we call focal species management, as opposed to ecosystem management. So, you know, you might be managing a bottomland hardwood forest just to have a healthy functioning ecosystem, and that's perfectly fine. But if you're managing for a particular wildlife species in that bottomland hardwood forest ecoregion, ecosystem, you would be doing different things. You may be cutting areas more often. You may be trying to dam up water in some areas. There's lots of different ways that you would be going about managing that area. And with regard to, you know, more upland sites, we're typically talking about disturbance, where we're setting back succession and matching the requirements of the species that we're interested in, from early successional communities to more mid-successional communities. And that would be dominated by some of those early pioneering tree species, whether it be elms, cedars, pines, many others. But even within that mid-successional stage, if you will, that may be young with a high stem density and a dense structure that limits visibility, or you might be in a 45-year-old Virginia pine stand. And so the species is the same, but the structure presented there is totally different. And many of the wildlife species that would be present there are totally different. So I don't know if I went way outside of what you were looking for.
No, that's really great. And I think it brings up a lot of what you said, kind of made the wheels turn in my mind. And I thought of a few things. And so you talked about, you know, obviously successional stages in plant communities, and there's lots of different plants, obviously, that can make up those successional stage or plant communities. So how does one tease out the value of certain plants to certain wildlife species in those plant communities? And then second part of the question is how does one go about, and maybe we'll get into this later, but how does one go about manipulating those plant species to either encourage them, you know, discourage them, to or broader to manage those plant communities?
Go over that first part again.
So the first part is you talked a lot about the successional stages and plant communities. So how do you go about determining the value of the various plant species that make up those larger plant communities, like their value to wildlife?
The value, of course, can come from the composition of plants, whether that plant is a food plant or not. Let's say, for example, ragweed versus sickle pod, for example, that's two forbs. And if I'm looking at an early successional community and I see a lot of forbs in there or grasses that deer or whatever don't like, then I'm going to get rid of those plants and promote the plants that they do like. Same thing in a shrub area or in a forested area. If there are trees in that area or shrubs in that area that are not producing food items for the wildlife species that I'm interested in, then I'm going to get rid of them. If those plants are not providing a cover source, then I'm going to get rid of them. But meshing those two are very important. There may be plants in a field that are providing really good structure for field sparrow or for turkey broods, but they might not be food plants. Well, that's okay. And so your job is to decide and evaluate how many food plants are present and are needed for the number of species that I'm expected to support in this area. But I argue that the cover resources is in most cases is most important. Food attracts wildlife, but cover holds wildlife. And so blending those together where you can have both food and cover in the same vegetation type is a win-win. And then with regard to managing that, then, we go back to the standard practices of either mechanical, fire, chemical, whether we're using prescribed fire, different herbicides, and then all of the many different mechanical techniques. And then of course, grazing may be used in various ways if livestock are present on the property to make an area more attractive and more usable by various species.
Great. So to take that question a little further, if you're working with landowners and talking with them about kind of what we just talked about, identifying which plants are food and which plants are cover, what is your best recommendation to give to landowners to access that knowledge of being able to identify, not even being able to identify a plant, but how do you go about actually identifying its value as a cover plant or as a food plant? And I think, obviously we're trained in a lot of those aspects, and we gain that knowledge through experience and through research and studies. But how does a landowner reach that knowledge?
Well, unfortunately for me, you can't just pour it into somebody's head. Boy, I sure wish somebody could pour all that into my head for all the things that I don't know that I wish I did. But when I approach this with landowners, and not just landowners that, a lot of people might think don't know as much as a wildlife manager. There's some brilliant landowners out there, just as smart, obviously, as we are, or smarter, but, including wildlife professionals. And they're kind of sitting there with oh my gosh, what do I do? How do I figure this out? Because I didn't learn all these plants. And so what I tell them to try and make it as easy as possible is just try to learn the 10 most common plants in this area, whether we might be in the woods, and you go around, you count, all right, I count 8 species, right here within sight, or 11 species, or whatever the case. And in most situations, and a lot of situations, there may be just gobs of species, but more often than not, there's only a few. If you can learn 10 trees, you will have a working knowledge of the forest that you're working in. If you can learn 10 plants in that field that you're wanting to manage for songbirds, for deer, for turkeys, for bobwhite, whatever the case may be, 10 plants, you are way ahead of the game in terms of knowing, number one, what is that plant? What species is it? But then what might it provide? Does it provide food, or does it provide cover, and how? And if not, then how do I get rid of it, and how do I promote more desirable plants? So I think it's good to start them off at a small number and say, just learn 10 plants. And, it's amazing when you go from property to property to property, and there's lots of times I go to properties, I don't know what many of the plants are, but there's always, 2 or 3 or 4 that are fairly prevalent. And so if I can just learn 2 or 3 or 4 plants in that situation, then I have a much better working knowledge of how to manage that property better for what I'm interested in. So start small and build up incrementally. And I never tell them to go look at some dichotomous key just pick up some good guides. But yeah, you got to do some homework. You can't just flip through a guide, although it has nice color pictures, which I like, and know all of your plants. You have to have, a little bit of time invested, and that comes from your interest. If you're not really interested in this, then you're not going to do it. But if you're really interested in managing your property for wildlife, then you would want to know what the plants are, at least the dominant plants on your property. And so I think that interest then drives most of them. And when they recognize, wow, I never really looked at it, but when I do, you're right. There's not that many different ones if I just learn these few. Now, of course, I know there's some people out in the Midwest, especially in native prairie. Oh, Craig, good night. There's 100 species, out here per square meter nearly, and that's true in many cases. Where you've got these native plant communities intact. But let's be honest, in the eastern U.S. and most of these highly disturbed properties, the plant species richness on those sites is not that great, and it doesn't take that much effort to learn a few plants.
So I've been thinking while you've been talking, Craig, about a lot of what you're talking about is manipulating extant vegetation communities, which is definitely how I think about wildlife habitat management. And when I think about places where I want to do wildlife habitat management, it's a timber stand or it's an old field or something like that. But I get the impression from my interactions with landowners and frankly with my father and others that a lot of what they think about for wildlife habitat is what they put in a blank spot with a planter. And so I'm curious what you think about the use of plantings in wildlife habitat management and what role they have and to what extent you sort of think of that in your repertoire of wildlife habitat management practices.
Well, I grew up on a farm in Piedmont, North Carolina, and as many, and I don't know if this is true, but I would bet it's true that a majority of the rural landowners in the eastern United States, their ancestors came from Europe, where it was extremely commonplace to plant whatever it was that they wanted. And so when they came here and settled Eastern North America, it was ubiquitous that they cleared forest and they ripped up sod of, native grasslands, and they planted crops. They planted crops to eat, and they planted crops for their livestock to eat. And so that became standard practice. And then we created federal government agencies that taught landowners, farmers, how to plant better, which was absolutely good and needed practice. But along the way, we totally overlooked the value of our native plant communities for the native wildlife species that we are interested in. And so that carried right on into the 21st century and even today, where we continue to promote, in my opinion, way too much planting as opposed to just using the natural plant communities. And that's where, we've had a number of projects, and the little slogan that I come up with is, and my gosh, how much stuff have I planted, from native grasses and forbs to food plots to trees and shrubs. Yes, I'm one of those that was guilty back in the 1980s working wildlife agency planting shrub lespedeza and autumn olive and all that kind of thing. I mean, just stop. My gosh, if you get hardly any rainfall at all to support a shrub, there's going to be shrubs coming up fairly quickly. And so instead of planting what you want, if you kill what you don't want, I have found that to be so much more effective, number one, and way more efficient. And I'll give you a couple of examples. I was on a property not long ago in Kentucky, and they were interested in planting more shrub cover. at the same time, they were asking me what herbicide to use to get rid of all of these sprouting shrubs and trees on an adjacent area. And I said, do you not see what you're looking at? You could just leave this area alone and you would have this dense woody cover that you desire. And moreover, if you planted the shrubs in this area, what would you be doing to all of the shrubs that would be coming up naturally? You would be having to set them back, either by clipping them or spraying them or something. And so it's almost something that we don't realize or recognize, is that we can use the seed bank. And we have looked at this in any number of places, from New York to eastern Kansas to northern Mississippi, North Florida, all in between, how when you get rid of, whether it's in a crop field that is no longer cropped, a hay field or pasture that is no longer hayed or pastured, or just in an area that has recently been cleared, if you get rid of those undesirable species, you're going to have other species come in. Some of those are going to be desirable. Some of them are not going to be desirable. And so if you get rid of the undesirable ones and allow the desirable ones to colonize and others to come in, it's been our experience, and certainly we've published the results, how you can get what you want much quicker than when you're fighting the competition in what you've planted.
Well, I was just grinning ear to ear the whole time you were saying that. One, because I'm learning stuff particularly about your work with seed banks and things like that. But two, because I do fight that. I have the same sort of impressions and fight those same challenges, whether it's wetland management, grassland management, or particularly any sort of advanced successional phases. So really appreciate your sharing and thinking on that. I guess the only lingering question then is that question of what do you do with things that have been in row crops for a century or more? What do you do with something that's been that's basically a totally clean slate, like a turf grass area in a city or something like that? Is that sort of the rare exception to where you think like, well, yeah, there you could choose your species?
Well, let me first back up and say, I didn't say that there's never a need to plant anything. I did not say that. I said that we don't always need to plant something. And in my opinion, for the scads of landowners, that's a technical term, Adam, scads. For the scads of landowners that I work with, for what they're interested in. And let's be honest, that's going to be deer, turkeys, and quail for 99.9% of them. There are many more now. That number is increasing a little bit, that are interested in grassland or shrubland songbirds, that are interested in some, quote, non-traditional focal species that most landowners are interested in. But for those common species that the vast majority of landowners are interested in, they don't have to have what you might call relic prairie species in order to serve their habitat requirements. A bobwhite or a turkey poult is perfectly happy under pigweed, horseweed, and cockleburr. Now, somebody's going to send me some hate mail.
Yeah,
about
we
whatever.
think so.
I don't care. But we just mentioned.
I'll be there right with you.
I just mentioned 3 native forbs. And if you've ever hunted doves near a field that had a bunch of pigweed seed in it, that's what you pulled out of its crop. I mean, that's just what they were adapted to. But when I say you can take a field that was in crop production literally for 50 years, what did that agricultural producer do in that crop field every year to get the crop to produce something? At least for the last 20 or 30 years, they sprayed it because something continues to come up. Now, you're not going to have the same species that were there in 1732, but you're going to have a variety of species coming up that will serve the habitat requirements for a majority of the wildlife species that we're interested in. That is not always the case. So I'm not saying that. And if you're more interested in some of the more relic species that were there historically, yes, you're going to have to plant that. But for most of these landowners, they're not worried about that. All they're doing is saying, what do I do with this field to manage for this? And if they have something there that will support that species, they're happy. And if they don't have to spend $500 to $1,000 per acre to do it, and go down the road and rent the drill and get that and all these herbicides and whatever, it's more work than what is necessary in a majority of situations. And that was something that was pointed out in one of the papers we recently published in Restoration Ecology, is that simply using the seed bank was 4.5 times more cost effective than planting. And in using the seed bank, we got the same or better results with regard to composition and structure for the wildlife species that are commonly managed for in the eastern U.S. And that included shrub, early successional songbirds, as well as quail, turkeys, and white-tailed deer.
Yeah, that's a really good point you make there. And I think you've really given us a master class on wildlife and plants. And I know I certainly learned something, and I think Adam did as well. So just kind of one wrap-up question of where can wildlife managers, biologists, and landowners learn more about a lot of the stuff that you talked about, plant ID, managing your woods, things like that. Like any good publications you can link us to, and we put in the description.
Well, I imagine the listeners to your podcast are going far and wide, Jared and Adam, and so there's a lot of them. There are tree guides and plant guides for the Northeast, the Midwest, even your particular states, of course, in the Southeast. So here. I don't know if you want me to mention a few individual ones, but like weeds of the South, weeds of the Northeast, forest plants of the Southeast, those are all very good, really, throughout the majority of the eastern U.S. And weeds of the Great Plains is covering all kinds of things out west of Tennessee and Missouri and westward of there into the Great Plains, of course. I mean, there's a lot of different plant guides. I wouldn't necessarily concentrate on one or two individual ones, but search around and see what you can find. And obviously don't overlook your state's extension service, especially with regard to publications on land management and wildlife management, and your state wildlife agency. A lot of state wildlife agency has a landowner's guide to wildlife, something like that are available.
Good. I think that'll at least provide people with direction. And I think I have more plant ID books on my bookshelf than I do wildlife ID books. So they're far and wide.
Well, I'm glad to hear that you were picking up a few bird species as well. To be a good naturalist, it's not just plants, it's not just birds, not just butterflies, but, trying to learn a little bit about all of these things that we interact with as we walk through the fields and the forest. I definitely am one that believes that leads to a richer life when you are able to recognize more of the things that are around you and appreciate them.
Oh, I learned something about life and something about the natural world every time I step foot outside.
And that's a perfect place to end it. And we just want to remind the listeners that if you like the show, please leave us a review and a rating, and also find in the show notes, along with a bunch of resources about today's episode, including a wonderful book that Dr. Harper humbly didn't mention, but we'll include in the notes. Please find there also an evaluation that we're looking for your feedback. So thanks for listening to Habitat University today, and we'll catch you on the next episode.
Habitat University is hosted by Purdue Extension and Iowa State University Extension and Outreach, and is part of the Natural Resources University Podcast Network.
The network is supported by the Renewable Resources Extension Act. If you liked Habitat University, subscribe and listen to the other podcasts in the Natural Resources University Podcast Network.
Iowa State University and Purdue University are equal opportunity, equal access, and affirmative action institutions.